Imagine a man burdened by a lifetime of deceit and manipulation. This is Jacob, whose journey was marked by cunning, always seeking to gain what he desired, even at the expense of others. From his mother's womb, he wrestled. The Bible tells us that Jacob and his twin brother, Esau, struggled even before they were born. This rivalry followed him throughout his life. Jacob always sought to be ahead, from holding on to Esau's heel at birth to using cunning to take his brother's birthright blessing as an adult. Esau, the firstborn, was supposed to inherit the blessings of his father, Isaac. But Jacob, driven by an uncontrollable desire for blessing, deceived his father, pretending to be Esau to receive the blessing that was not rightfully his. This bold move set him on an irreversible path, leading to a life of flight, fleeing from his enraged brother, fleeing from his homeland, perhaps fleeing from himself. For years, Jacob lived under the shadow of his choices, amassing wealth, building a family, but always haunted by the ghost of his past. He had everything many would desire: possessions, wives, children, but he lacked peace. Jacob knew that one day he would have to face his greatest fear, reuniting with Esau, the brother he had betrayed. And that moment was drawing nearer. He received news that Esau was coming with 400 men. Jacob feared the worst. Now, on the banks of the Jabbok River, on a dark and silent night, Jacob is alone. He has sent his family, servants, and possessions ahead, hoping to appease Esau's anger with gifts and wealth. But he remained behind, alone. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, Jacob was truly alone with himself, without distractions, without plans to deceive or flee. The tension of that night was palpable. Jacob's fate hung in the balance. Would the encounter with Esau be a reckoning? Would it be the end of a man who had spent his life fighting against everyone, and even against God? It was a night charged with fear, anguish, and a deep sense that something was about to happen. And it was in this solitude, in this almost supernatural silence, that something extraordinary occurred. Jacob did not know it, but he was about to have the most impactful encounter of his life. It would not be with Esau, it would be with God. The stage was set for a spiritual confrontation that would change his destiny forever. An encounter that would force him to face his errors, his weaknesses, and finally find a new identity. Not the deceiver, but someone transformed by the divine touch. That night, by the Jabbok River, Jacob was about to confront his greatest adversary, himself. And then, in the midst of that darkness, something unexpected happens. A man appears and attacks him, without warning, without explanation. Jacob finds himself in a fierce struggle, hand to hand, in the dead of night. There are no words exchanged, only the sound of bodies wrestling and the rustling of the surrounding vegetation. The identity of the adversary is unclear to Jacob at first, but there is something different about this fight. It's not like facing an ordinary man. The strength of this stranger is supernatural, and Jacob, accustomed to confronting challenges with cleverness and cunning, finds himself up against an opponent who pushes him to his physical and spiritual limits. Hour after hour, the fight continues. The effort exhausts his body, fatigue accumulates, but Jacob does not give up. He holds on tight. His muscles are tense, his hands begin to slip from sweat, but he persists. There is something at stake here, more than a mere physical victory. Jacob feels that this struggle has a much deeper meaning. He is fighting for something greater, perhaps for his redemption, perhaps for a blessing, or perhaps to prove to himself that he is no longer the man fleeing from his mistakes. He is battling against the destiny that has followed him all his life. The night progresses. The moon casts its pale light over the scene, but the fight goes on. Neither side yields. Jacob feels the pain intensify, but he knows he cannot let go. There is a conviction that keeps him firm, and as time goes on, he realizes that this is not just a physical struggle. He is facing something divine. The presence he is grappling with is not that of a mere man. It is as if Jacob is wrestling with God himself. Then, at dawn, the opponent does something surprising. With a single touch to Jacob's thigh, he dislocates his hip. A sharp pain pierces his body, a pain that could have paralyzed him completely. But Jacob, even wounded, even as his body screams in exhaustion, does not give up. He holds on and, in a mix of pain and determination, cries out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." At this moment, the adversary pauses. The physical struggle ceases, but something much deeper happens. This man, now clearly identified as a divine being, looks at Jacob and asks a question that echoes to the very depths of his soul. "What is your name?" Jacob answers. But in that simple Jacob, he is not just stating his name. He is confessing his identity. He is admitting who he has been: the deceiver, the usurper, the one who always sought to assert himself through trickery. And in that instant, something changes forever. The fight had ceased, but the impact of the words still hung in the air. Jacob, by revealing his name, was finally admitting who he was: the deceiver, the trickster, the one who always relied on cunning to succeed. It was a confession, not just of his identity, but of his journey up to that moment. He stood bare before God, no longer with hands full of tricks, but with a vulnerability he had never experienced before. And then something miraculous happened. The divine man, with a powerful serenity, replied, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." Israel, a new name, a new identity. In that instant, Jacob ceased to be merely the man who always fought against people and his own destiny. Now, he was the man who wrestled with God and survived. But more than surviving, he was transformed. The name Israel meant far more than a mere change of title. It signified a new path. No longer defined by past mistakes, Jacob, now Israel, had a new chance to live as one who had been marked and shaped by God. But this blessing came at a cost. The touch on his hip that dislocated his thigh was not just a physical wound. It was a reminder. Every time Jacob limped, every painful step would be a sign of the struggle he had with God that night, and it would mark him for the rest of his life. He was no longer the Jacob running away, trying to evade confrontation. Now he would walk with a limp, a symbol of his dependence on God. Curiously, this wound was also a kind of blessing. The dislocated thigh was physical evidence that Jacob had been transformed by this encounter. He was no longer the same man. The internal struggle, which had been fought secretly for so many years, was now manifesting visibly. And every time he felt pain while walking, he would remember that this was the night his life changed forever. At dawn, the divine man disappears. The Jabbok River, silent witness to this extraordinary struggle, flows in peace once more. Jacob, panting, wounded, but blessed, rises slowly. His body is weary, but his spirit has never been more alert. The sun begins to rise, and with it, a new beginning for Israel. Now, Jacob's true journey was just beginning. The man who wrestled with God was finally ready to face the world, no longer as the deceiver he once was, but as the chosen, the blessed, the transformed man. Jacob, or rather, Israel, rose with difficulty, feeling the weight of the struggle in every muscle of his body. The pain in his hip was constant, but he no longer saw it as a weakness. It was a reminder of the encounter that had redefined his life, a mark that there was no turning back. He was now a transformed man, someone who had wrestled with God and survived. As the sun emerged on the horizon, bathing the Jabbok Valley in a gentle light, Israel realized that the internal struggle that had accompanied him throughout his life, the restlessness, fear, and guilt, was, in some way, being healed. He was no longer the fugitive Jacob. He was Israel, the man who faced the impossible and emerged victorious, not because he won by strength, but because he persevered until he was blessed. But the blessing was not just a new name or a new identity. There was an implicit promise in this encounter, the promise that God was with him. The weight of carrying this new name came with a mission. He would no longer live for himself, seeking personal gain. Now he represented something greater. He was the bearer of a covenant. As he walked with a limp, each slow and painful step, Israel knew that the next great test awaited him, the reunion with Esau. that same brother whom he had deceived and betrayed many years before. Fear still lingered, but something had changed in Israel. The man he was before that night would have devised elaborate plans to avoid confrontation or manipulate the situation. Now, however, he would face whatever came with his head held high, confident that if God had blessed him that night, he would not abandon him the next day. And so, as he approached his destination, Israel began to see Esau's figure in the distance. His heart raced. Was Esau still filled with hatred? Were the 400 men with him meant for battle? Each step felt heavier, the weight of doubt and tension increasing. But Israel was no longer the man who ran. He moved forward, not by his own strength, but with the confidence of one who had received a blessing directly from God. Whatever the outcome, he was ready to face whatever came. The figure of Esau was approaching, accompanied by the growing sound of his 400 men marching behind him. Israel's heart was pounding, but he could no longer afford to hesitate. Each step he took reminded him of the pain in his thigh, but also of the new name and purpose he carried. He was Israel, the man who had wrestled with God and prevailed. And this title, this blessing, filled him with courage. As the moment of encounter drew nearer, Israel arranged his family, his servants, and his possessions in front of him as a form of protection. But instead of staying behind, he did something unexpected. Israel walked in front of everyone. It was an act of humility, of surrender, but also of trust. He, who had so often manipulated and hidden behind others, now took the lead, limping with each step, but advancing without hesitation. Then, the distance between him and Esau began to shrink. Israel saw his brother's face more clearly now. The face that had once carried hatred and revenge. The face of the one he had deceived to steal the birthright blessing. It was an inevitable meeting, and Israel knew it. The tension was at its peak. When they were finally face to face, silence hung in the air. Those seconds seemed to stretch on forever. But then, something surprising happened. Esau, instead of drawing a weapon or ordering an attack, ran toward Israel. For a moment, Israel's heart tightened, bracing for the worst. But then, in front of everyone, Esau embraced him. Not with hatred, but with tears in his eyes. The brother he had feared, the one he had fled from for so many years, was now standing before him, crying. Israel, exhausted and limping, also began to cry. The weight of years of guilt, fear, and regret fell away in that moment. What he had feared, the revenge of Esau, dissolved before him. Esau's embrace was the unexpected answer to his prayers. The two brothers who had been enemies were now reconciled. And in that reconciliation, Israel realized something even deeper. Just as he had wrestled with God and emerged transformed, he was now confronting his past and experiencing a redemption he had never imagined. God had not only given him a new identity, but restored what he had lost along the way: peace with his brother. The relief that washed over Israel was immense. Esau had forgiven him, and the ghost of the past that had haunted him was finally exorcised. God had been faithful, guiding Israel even through chaos and struggle. The blessing was not just spiritual. It was complete, encompassing all he had feared and all he needed to confront. Now, limping but lighter than ever, Israel was able to look towards the future. The struggle was behind him, but the blessing would accompany him with every step. He was no longer the man who fled, but someone who faced his greatest fears and found peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but Israel was ready to face it with courage, wisdom, and the assurance that God's grace would accompany him in every step of his journey. As the two brothers remained embraced, the dust of the long road seemed to finally settle. The sounds of Esau's men and Israel's servants around them were muffled by the emotion of the reunion. There was a silent understanding between them, a mutual comprehension that something greater had occurred. It wasn't just the reconciliation of two brothers, but the closing of an old wound that had begun even before their births. When they parted, both still with tearful eyes, Israel felt a new sensation, something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Not the superficial peace of avoiding conflicts, but the deep peace of facing what he feared most and coming out on the other side with a new perspective. His struggle at Jabbok had not been merely a battle with God, but a prelude to what he was now living, a complete redemption. Esau, with a genuine smile on his face, looked at Israel and, without hesitation, offered him something unexpected. He refused the gifts and wealth that Israel had sent earlier, as if to say that material things were not important. The real significance was the reunion. This gesture further disarmed Israel's heart. The brother he had wronged so deeply was now offering forgiveness, not demanding reparations. But despite the joy of this reunion, Israel knew that his journey was not yet over. He felt deep within that this divine blessing was not just for reconciliation with Esau. God had changed his name, and with it his mission had also transformed. He was no longer just a man who fled. He now had a greater purpose, a covenant to carry. As Esau suggested they travel together, Israel, though grateful, requested to go ahead. The injury to his hip made him walk slower, but it wasn't just that. He needed time to process everything that had happened. The encounter with God, the reconciliation with his brother, and a new future unfolding before him. Esau, understanding, agreed, and went ahead with his men. Israel, now alone with his family, looked around, and the reality of his transformation began to deepen. The man who once bowed before others, seeking advantages, was now walking with his head held high, even with a limp. Every step he took, though painful, was a reminder that he had been touched by God and that this set him apart forever. Along the way, Israel reflected on all he had learned. The struggle he fought with the man at Jabbok was not just a matter of physical strength. It was a test of his will, of his ability to persist until he was blessed. And that blessing, more than a new name, was a new life, a life of dependence on God, not on his own cunning. He knew that the road ahead would still have challenges. But now he carried something he had never had before, confidence in God's faithfulness and the assurance that, even in his weaknesses, he was chosen and blessed. Israel continued his journey, each step slow and marked by the pain in his hip, but also by the deep sense of purpose now filling his being. With each new day of walking, he felt the weight of his past diminishing and the responsibility for his future growing. He was no longer the man who fled or schemed. Now, he walked as the leader of a great family and as the bearer of God's promise. Along the way, Israel reflected on what this meant. The new name that God had given him was not just a title, but a renewed identity, a call to live differently. He had wrestled with God and emerged transformed, and now his mission was to lead his descendants with faith and justice. He knew that his children and grandchildren would be the beginning of something much greater, a nation that would carry the very name that God had given him, Israel. Amid these reflections, Israel began to realize something else. His old way of handling problems with manipulation and deceit no longer had a place in his life. Now, he was wholly dependent on divine guidance. This became clear when he faced difficult decisions. Previously, he would have schemed, planned ways to circumvent the situation. But now he prayed. Now he waited on God. The family tensions that once tormented him, especially between his sons, reminded him of how he had caused discord in his own family by taking Esau's blessing. He knew he needed to do things differently. If he had learned anything from that night of wrestling at Jabbok, it was that true change can only happen through a genuine encounter with God. And that was what he wished for his children. They did not need to repeat his mistakes. As the sun set on the horizon, casting golden hues over the land they traveled, Israel lifted his eyes to the sky. He felt in his spirit that his life was now a constant walk with God, and with each step, even while limping, he trusted that he was on the right path. The mark of the divine touch on his hip, the pain that accompanied him, had become a constant reminder that he was no longer in control, but was guided by something far greater than himself. This dependence, this humility before the power of God, was what kept him standing. Even with pain, even slowly, he continued, knowing that God was ahead. Each night, when they camped, Israel looked at his family and saw the future. God's promises echoed in his mind. a numerous descendants, a promised land. He knew that although he might not see all these things come to fruition in his lifetime, he was planting the seeds of something eternal. The days passed, and Israel continued his journey. At each stop, he looked at his family, his legacy, and reflected on how God had shaped his life in ways he could never have imagined. The man who once used deceit to achieve his goals now understood that his true strength came from his weakness, from his dependence on God. As he walked, the pain in his hip remained, but he accepted it as part of his new identity. Each step, though difficult, was a reminder that he had wrestled with God and emerged transformed. More than the pain, what guided him now was the promise. He knew that his journeys, both physical and spiritual, were leading him to a future that he might not fully see realized, but that his descendants would inherit. Then one day, they arrived at a special place, Bethel, the place where, years earlier, Jacob, then a young fugitive, had his first vision of God, the ladder reaching from earth to heaven, and the promises God had made to him. At that time, Jacob was a man living in fear, fleeing from Esau, not fully understanding what awaited him. Now, Israel returned to Bethel, no longer as the man who fled, but as the man God had transformed. There in Bethel, he built an altar, a way to consecrate his journey and his new life to the Lord. At that moment, he did something profound. He remembered all the promises God had made, from the time he was fleeing to that encounter at Jabbok. Now, each of them made sense in a new and clear way. God had been with him at every moment, in both his mistakes and his victories. And as he built that altar, Israel offered a sincere prayer. He did not ask for wealth or security. Instead, he gave thanks. He thanked God for his transformation. He thanked him for the name he had given him, for his struggles, and even for the pain he now bore as a sign of his blessing. For Israel, Bethel was not just a place of remembrance. It was the mark that his life had been guided by something far greater than his own plans. There, he completely surrendered to God's will, accepting that his story was part of a divine plan. And in that acceptance, Israel found a peace that did not depend on circumstances, but on the presence of God in his life. When Israel and his family left Bethel to continue their journey, he knew that, even if the path was difficult, his mission was clear. He would no longer be the man fighting against his destiny, but the man who accepted God's call and lived according to that truth. From then on, every step he took, even while limping, was guided by a greater purpose. And so, Israel continued his path, knowing that God's blessing had not only transformed him, but also secured the future of his descendants. That impactful encounter with God that night changed his destiny forever. And now, he walked with the certainty that his legacy, his family, and his new name would forever be linked to God's plan for his people. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to stay updated on the new videos posted here on the channel.